Shalom, Beth El family. It's Thursday, time to post another uh, video of our discussion at Beth El in Norfolk last week. Last Shabbat, we read Parshat Shoftim from the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, and we explored in particular the role of the king and the prophet and the priest and all the different kinds of leaders that are mentioned in this Parsha, and specifically about responsibility, which is an interesting concept. So I hope you'll stay with me and as we explore it a little more deeply. The reason this came up, I had the opportunity by coincidence to hear Justin Fairfax. He's a state senator from Virginia who's running for lieutenant governor. Now, I will say this is not in any way a political endorsement or anything like that. I was just very interested in what he had to say. He was introducing himself, and as many politicians do, or people, when they introduce themselves, they tell their story of why they are doing what they're doing. He told a great story about how his grandparents took in his mother, who had fallen on hard times, and all their kids, and that he felt like his life could have gone very differently if they were not so generous as to open their house to his family, and he felt a responsibility to pay it back. It's very interesting, that idea of he felt responsibility. And it really rang for me because it raised the question, from where do we get responsibility? And so we had a discussion in the sanctuary about what do people feel responsible for, and from where do they think that responsibility stems. So a number of people mention responsibility for their children to raise them well and give them the opportunity to succeed. When I asked, where does that come from? It's tough. One answer was that they did not choose to be born, and therefore, having brought them into the world, we owe them to help them succeed. People talked about the Jewish community, how they felt a responsibility to give back to the synagogue or to give back to the Jewish community, which had been established for them. I asked, where did that come from? And they said, sort of a pay it forward kind of thing. And then one person mentioned, God created us as part of God's creation, and therefore we have a responsibility to that creation. And that was the answer I was looking for. It's not impossible to understand our sense of responsibility without understanding a connection to God, but it certainly is easier when we do. Because understanding that God created us as part of creation tells us that we have a responsibility to that creation. It's not that we were the pinnacle of creation and the universe owes us everything. Unfortunately, an attitude that seems popular in our culture, but in fact, we, as a part of creation, and in fact, an important part because we are intelligent, because we have language, because we have the ability to do great things, it is our responsibility to partner with God, to aid God, to be God's tool in perfecting creation, making creation better, and so on and so forth. So that was our conversation about responsibility. We then turned to this idea of responsibility as leadership, because Parshat Shoftim talks about, for the first time, the institution of a king. It talks about the priesthood, who takes care of the religious roles. It talks about the prophet, who has this responsibility for connecting the people to God. And it talks about judges, who have responsibility for upholding the law and making sure that the society stays moral and that people are able to live their lives in a positive way. I was particularly interested in the passage about kings from Deuteronomy 17 to 20. It says, "And he shall not take many wives for himself, and his heart must not turn away, and he shall not acquire much silver and gold for himself." Okay, so he's not allowed to be a chazer. And there were actually passages before this. He's not allowed to collect a lot of horses. Right? You shouldn't think that because he's the king, he should be able to collect a lot of wealth. Then in verse 18 it says, "And it will be when he sits upon his royal throne that he shall write for himself 2 copies of the Torah on a scroll, and he should copy it from the scroll that the Levitic Kohanim have." Okay, so he shouldn't think that he knows everything because he's the king. He should have this Torah with him at all times in order to judge. And it says, "And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this Torah and these statutes to perform them. And verse 20, so that his heart will not be haughty over his brothers, and so that he will not turn away from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, in order that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons among Israel. Right? So what is this king all about? Right? So you get this description. He shouldn't be greedy and collecting wealth more than anyone else. He shouldn't think he knows everything. He's got to have the Torah with him at all times. He should not be all prideful. I'm the king and you're just a subject and therefore you have to pay homage to me. No, he should be humble with the other people. Those are the things that this Parsha tells us about a king. What seems to be missing? A job description, right? We're told what the king is not, but we're not told what the king is. I think there's a simple reason for this, because it's obvious. It's obvious to the Torah. It might not be obvious to us. The king is imbued with responsibility for everyone else. The king is a functionary of the people. And we shouldn't be confused, because when we think of a king, we think of, like the Pharaoh was king, he was a god. This is being very specific. This king is not like a god, right? This king should not collect wealth. He shouldn't have lots of wives. He shouldn't even be prideful with other people. He is a functionary of the government, a functionary of the people. Everyone comes together and imbues him with a certain level of authority in order to make their society run better, just like they would other functionaries like judges, or by today's standards, rabbis or bankers, or people who we give special functions to so that society works. That's what the king is. The king is there to serve everyone else. The king is a functionary of responsibility. That name, that word in Hebrew, responsibility, is achrayut, right? And the rabbi tells one possible derivation of achrayut is from acher. It's from the other. That our responsibility, even the king's responsibility, is always to serve the other, not to think about ourselves. And that's why in Chochmah U'Musar, the work of the Alter of Chelm, the Musar work of the Alter of Chelm, he brings a passage where he describes all these leaders of Israel, all these leaders of the Jewish people. What was their job? At least their first job, overwhelmingly, they were shepherds. Jacob was a shepherd, and David was a shepherd, and Moses was a shepherd. And there are all these midrashim that tell us how they went out of their way for their flocks. Right? A story about Moses, who had a lamb wander off to a watering hole, and he was all annoyed and upset. He had to chase this lamb, and then he sees that it just went to drink some water. He says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were so thirsty." And he takes the lamb, and he puts the lamb on his shoulders and carries it back to the rest of the flock. That's how concerned he was, even about a lamb. So how much more so the people he would come to lead. And David, we learn about how he would first let the younglings of his flock go out to eat so that they could eat the most tender grass. And then he would let the elderly sheep of his flock go out to eat because they could eat the normal grass. And then only when there was tough grass left, he would let the rest of the flock who could take care of themselves. And of course, if he would pay so much attention and be so careful about his sheep, how much more so his people. Right? Being a leader in Judaism means being responsible for others. It's not a prideful thing of glory. It is a humble task that requires putting others before yourself. Achrayut, others, acher, acherim, before yourself. And in Judaism, we are all, in some ways, called upon to be that kind of leader, right? We are a nation of leaders. We consider ourselves all to have responsibility for what goes on around us. Alan Marinas, in his book Everyday Holiness, which we've been making a study of over the summer as we've gone exploring different midot of musar, and achrayut, responsibility is one of them. He said responsibility takes on an even greater importance because it stands for and reflects a central thrust to spiritual growth, which is to rise up and beyond living in our small self, who is interested only in gratification in the present, to evolve into a larger self, who, from its elevated vantage point, can see and take in both the larger sweep of time and the living presence of others. And here's the great line: responsibility is both the means and the fruit of evolution. Right? We take on responsibility, we grow as a human being in our humility and our ability to serve others, and then we take on more responsibility because it feels good, because it's part of who we are and who we are supposed to be as God's creations. It's what we owe to God. That's where the responsibility comes from in Judaism. So 2 things I want to share with you about that. First of all, we're coming into the month of Elul. We celebrated Rosh Chodesh Elul last week. And now we're on this journey towards reflecting on our past year and moving towards the next year. And in that journey, we need to challenge ourselves. How have we taken responsibility for others? And more importantly, how have we been able to step out of ourselves, out of the little space we keep around us, concerned about our needs and what we want, and been able to serve others? The one I want to share with you is about when I counsel couples with infertility, which unfortunately happens more often than I would like. We often sit and they are understandably very wrapped up in what they're going through. It's terrible. It's emotionally terrible. It's a terrible way to have to reflect on yourself and your body and why is it not working properly. And one of the pieces of advice I always give is not to pray for yourself and your own ability to have a child, but to think of all the other people in your situation and to pray on their behalf. Again, when we step outside of ourselves and offer that prayer for others, it changes our perspective. And I've been told by several couples that that's really helped, and that's enabled them to sort of move forward on their own journey, not getting caught in the trap of self-infatuation, right? Of not being able to think about anything else, but to move forward as a couple and on their journey. The second thing I want to mention to you, the second example of this I want to tell you is the Anti-Defamation League, right? And all of us after the horrible riot in Charlottesville 2 weeks ago, right? So the Anti-Defamation League was founded in the 1920s to respond to the Ku Klux Klan, as I remember the story, and did a great job. And over decades, it helped stamp out anti-Semitism for a long time here. It was always on the watch. And in the 80s and the 90s, when it seemed like maybe the function of the ADL wasn't as important, did it fold up? No. No. It made its mission about stamping out all hate. It became the leading organization in America of monitoring hate groups and hate websites and spreading the word that there were terrible, terrible hate groups rising, some anti-Semitism, but hate against so many other minorities. And the ADL stepped up to defend hate against Muslims and hate against Sikhs and hate against African Americans and hate against all minority groups. Because the ADL understands that when hate is rampant in the world, eventually that hate will be targeted at the Jews. And it understood that hate is in itself a terrible thing. And when it becomes part of our culture and becomes acceptable, it is a danger for all of us. And so I love the Anti-Defamation League, and I've been a supporter for some time. But now, more than ever, as we see anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head again, and if you are concerned about the scourge of anti-Semitism after Charlottesville, if you are now suddenly raising your voice, then achrayut is not something that you've been doing. Because the truth is, this has been going on for years, and we should have been raising our voice for years, raising our voice on behalf of hate against other minority groups, against other religions, because that's what achrayut means. It means we're not only concerned about ourselves, we are also concerned about the other. And now that we feel threatened to suddenly say, now we need to raise our voice, and now we need to question the government or the president or the websites or the hate groups or whatever it is, if we weren't raising our voice just as loudly 3 weeks ago as we have been for the last 2 weeks, then we have not been understanding achrayut. We have not been doing our job. And hopefully going forward as we reflect on the year to come, we know that this hate is not going to go away. We know that there will be targets towards Jews and others, and it is important that we step up and we raise our voices in the face of both those occasions. That is what it means to have achrayut. And I hope that we are all able, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, to reflect on our responsibility as leaders, our ability to be there for others, our ability to truly accept our responsibility as human beings and as Jews to stand in the face of all hate and all criticism of all peoples that is undue, that is unwarranted, that is the nasty scourge that we are now all too aware is affecting us. Wish you Shabbat Shalom. Look forward to chatting again next week.